The distress beacon from the Surath Choir-Reaches came in on the 41st day. I know that because I had been counting. Every morning in the pre-flight hold Atlantic Station, I would pull the passive intercept log before I ran my startup checklist, and every morning the same entry would blink at me in amber. Surath Choir-Reaches medical emergency, Tier 1 humanitarian Galactic Compact Q, pending review. 40 mornings. 40 times I watched that entry sit there the way a body sits in a flooding hull, still, but not still for good reasons. On the 41st morning it was gone. Not answered. Gone. The compact had quietly delisted it. I found the administrative note buried 3 pages deep in the Q purge. The distress signal had aged past the review window. The requesting civilization had failed to resubmit through the proper secondary channel within the mandated 37-day confirmation period, and the case had been administratively closed. Pending resource reallocation review. Thank you for your patience. I read that 3 times. I read it the first time quickly, the way you read something that you expect to resolve into something reasonable on the second read. It did not resolve into something reasonable on the second read. I read it the 3rd time very slowly, with the specific attention I reserve for things I need to be certain I am not misunderstanding. I was not misunderstanding it. Then I set my coffee down on the console very carefully, because I had learned a long time ago that when your hands want to do something they'll regret, you should put fragile things out of reach first. My name is Dace Rennick, Warrant Officer, 34th Humanitarian Lift Wing, Earth Allied Defense and Relief Command. I flew dropships, not warships, dropships. The distinction matters in ways that the galaxy never quite understood about us, and I will get to that. For now, what matters is that I was sitting in the pre-flight hold Atlantic Station on the 41st morning, reading an administrative closure notice for a civilization that had been dying for 40 days while the Galactic Compact held its meetings, and I was not yet angry. Anger comes later. In that moment I was only very, very tired. I pulled the original beacon. The Surath Choir-Reaches occupied a highland plateau system, 11 relay jumps from Lanark, not far, as humanitarian emergencies go. They were avian, the Surath. Not bird-like in the thin, fragile way that word sometimes suggests, but genuinely avian, feathered across the full body. The elder caste standing nearly 2 meters at the crown of their display plumage, with a bone structure that had evolved for high-altitude thermals and a respiratory system that ran twice as fast as a human's under exertion. Their society was organized around something that translated roughly as the choir, a system of council and governance built on harmonic resonance, elder singers who could hold 12-note chords, a civilization that had, for reasons I would not fully understand until I stood on their landing field, organized its entire political structure around the idea that a voice, properly heard, was the most powerful instrument in existence. 40 days ago, something they called the wasting cord had arrived in their highland cities. The beacon told me the rest in the flat language of emergency taxonomy. Respiratory collapse in the elder caste population, the ones with the most complex vocal architecture, the ones whose lungs had evolved for those 12-note holds. Cascading vascular inflammation following a pathogen that the Surath immune system had no category for. It was not a new plague in the biological sense. It was apparently a reactivated dormant agent, something the Surath had encountered and suppressed 500 years ago in a different climate context, now returned in a form their modern immune profiles could not read. Their own medical corps had the historical data. They did not have the treatment infrastructure. Their highland cities were high altitude, low pressure, and their hospital systems had been built for a population that had not experienced mass respiratory collapse in living memory. They were running out of supplemental oxygen. They were running out of the specific filtration compounds that kept the pathogen from spreading through their communal air recycling systems. They were running out of time. They had asked the Galactic Compact for a medical response team, biocontainment specialists, and supplemental atmospheric processing rigs. Standard Tier 1 humanitarian request. Absolutely within the Compact's stated mandate. The Compact had cued it. The Vethoran Hegemony, their nearest neighbors and treaty partners, had sent a note expressing regret that the current Vethoran seasonal administrative period made rapid deployment logistically complex, and they would revisit the matter at the close of the quarter. The Drell Consortium had cited the pathogen's dormantry activation profile as a quarantine trigger under Subprovision 7 of the Compact Biological Transit Accord, and formally declined to send personnel until an independent hazard classification was completed, a process that would take, at minimum, 90 days. The Orrven, who were the closest militarily capable species and had the biocontainment technology readily at hand, simply did not respond. 40 days. I read all of this in about 6 minutes. Then I sent a query to Wing Commander Adara Celes. Celes had been running the 34th for 11 years. She was not a person who made decisions quickly or loudly. She was a person who made decisions correctly. I sent her the beacon data, the Q-purge notice, the Compact administrative closure, and the Vethoran, Drell, and Orrven non-responses, all attached in a single message with a subject line that read, Surath Choir-Reaches, a requesting authorization for unilateral humanitarian response. She replied in 4 minutes, just 2 lines. Authorization granted, take what you need. I stared at that for a moment. In 11 years of flying humanitarian missions, I had never once needed a longer authorization than that. The 34th had a mandate and a doctrine and a command structure, and the command structure existed so that, when the person at the top of it said 2 lines, the person at the bottom of it didn't need 20. Adara Celes understood the situation as well as I did from the data I had sent her, and she understood it faster than I did in certain respects, because she had a longer operational memory. She had been doing this since before I'd earned my wings. She had watched the Compact's queue system age out emergency requests before. She had written, I later learned, a formal objection to the 37-day review window policy 6 years earlier, and the Compact's Administrative Council had received that objection and filed it in whatever the Compact filed things in when it intended to revisit them at a date that never arrived. 2 lines from Celes, authorization granted, take what you need. I went and got what I needed. The first thing I did was pull the 34th's full inventory against the Surath pathogen profile from the beacon's medical annex. This took longer than I wanted because the beacon's medical annex was detailed in the meticulous way that Surath documentation was detailed. They had been watching the illness for 40 days, and they had cataloged everything they could, every symptom progression, every transmission event they could trace, every failed treatment attempt, every resource they had already exhausted. I read all of it. I did not skim it. A field pilot who skims the medical annex before a mission is a field pilot who lands in a situation he didn't prepare for, and I had been doing this long enough to know that the worst surprises are the ones that were in the data all along. What the data told me was that the Surath had been trying. They had not been sitting and waiting for rescue while their people died. They had repurposed every filtration unit they had. They had instituted quarantine protocols within the molting halls as best they could with the equipment available. They had synthesized partial efficacy treatments from their own pharmaceutical stocks and administered them to the late-stage patients in the knowledge that partial efficacy was better than nothing, even when partial efficacy was not enough. The medical officers, Rethvan's team, which I would not learn was Rethvan's team until I landed, had not slept a full night cycle in 30 days. The beacon's medical annex had been updated continuously. The last entry was timestamped 9 hours before I read it, which meant someone had still been writing careful, meticulous clinical notes in the middle of a night when the Compact had already closed the queue and nobody was listening. I found that I needed to sit still for a moment after I read that. Just a moment. Then I went and got what I needed. What I needed, it turned out, was a considerable amount of things. The 34th Humanitarian Lift Wing operated out of Lanark Station with a standard complement of 6 heavy-lift dropships, 3 medium medevac shuttles, and a rotating deployment of the specialized payload modules that turned our cargo bays into whatever the emergency required: field surgical theaters, water purification stations, atmospheric processing rigs, biocontainment clean rooms, emergency shelter fabricators. We were not a war asset. The galaxy knew us as not a war asset. In fact, most of the Compact members who'd had any exposure to Earth's military operations had an extremely clear and well-documented idea of what the 34th was not. We were not the fleet that had stood off the Orrven at the Carina line for 8 months and left their assault wing in pieces across 17 cubic light-seconds of space. We were not the ground forces that had retaken the Kelva stations. We were not whatever had happened at Morn's Reach, which the Compact had classified and sealed, and which humans talked about in the way soldiers everywhere talk about certain things, in short sentences with long pauses. We were the dropship wing that came afterward when the shooting was done, and we rebuilt what was broken. That was the theory. That was the organizational classification. The galaxy had never entirely separated those two things in its mind, and I could not entirely blame it for that. The humans who flew the dropships were the same humans who fought the battles. The hands that set up the field hospitals had carried the rifles. The medics who ran the biocontainment protocols wore the same uniform patches as the soldiers who had made certain species very, very careful about not provoking humanity directly. You could not fully separate the image from the reality, even when the reality, this time, was a fleet of atmospheric processors and supplemental oxygen rigs descending on an alien plateau to save a civilization's elders from drowning in their own lungs. I did not think about any of that while I was loading out. I was thinking about payload manifests and atmospheric pressure differentials, and the specific filtration compound specifications that I had pulled from the beacon's medical annex. I was thinking about the fact that the Surath respiratory system ran at twice the metabolic rate of a human's, which meant their oxygen consumption under physiological stress was roughly double what our standard medevac modules were calibrated for, and I needed to get on the comm with the 34th's chief medical engineer before we lifted, not after. Chief Medical Engineer Priya Was was, at that moment, eating breakfast. She was the kind of person who ate breakfast with absolute conviction, regardless of what was happening around her, on the grounds that no one made good decisions on an empty stomach, and she had proven this so consistently over 11 years that nobody in the 34th argued with her about it anymore. I told her what we had. She set her fork down, not hurriedly, but with focus, and said, "Respiratory collapse in a high-altitude avian species. What's their lung volume ratio to body mass?" I told her what the beacon said. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Their communal air recyclers are going to be the vector. The pathogen is riding the recycled atmosphere between the molting halls. We need to put positive pressure biocontainment envelopes around every major hall before we touch the patients, or we'll suppress 1 outbreak node and seed 3 more. She paused. I'll need the Mark 7 biocontainment rigs, not the Mark 5s. We have 6 Mark 7s. Load them all. We have 6 heavy lifters. Then load 1 per ship and use the remaining bay space for oxygen. And Rennick, pull the historical pathogen profile. If this thing was suppressed 500 years ago, the Surath have the suppression protocol somewhere in their archives. We don't need to invent the cure. We need to get them the equipment to run the cure they already know. That was Priya Was. That was the 34th. I went and found the other pilots. There were 6 of us. Myself and Warrant Officer Teak Holland in the lead ships. Senior Warrant Officer Dalamar running her ship with the kind of silent intensity she brought to everything. Warrant Officers Yusuf Kane and Sella Park in the 2 mid-wing ships, and a pilot called Jenko who had been with the 34th for 4 months, and whom I had not fully evaluated yet, and who was about to be evaluated in the most direct possible manner. I briefed them in the hold. I did not give a speech. Speeches are for people who have time. I told them where we were going, what the situation was, how long the Surath had been waiting, what we were carrying, and what the atmospheric insertion profile looked like over a high-altitude plateau with a pathogen-active communal air system. I told them we would fly in biocontainment protocol from insertion, which meant suits from departure, which meant the next 12-plus hours were going to be uncomfortable. And I told them this was a humanitarian mission and not a combat operation, which was obvious but which I said anyway because it mattered to me that we all walked into this with the right frame in our heads. Nobody said that this wasn't strictly within our deployment orders. Nobody said that the compact hadn't formally authorized us. Nobody said that taking in unilateral humanitarian action 11 relay jumps from our home station, without species consent protocols in place, beyond the brief acknowledgement I had received from Surath Choir-Command, was the kind of thing that generated procedural review meetings and administrative correspondence that took months to resolve. They already knew all of that. The 34th was not a wing of people who were unaware of what they were doing. They were people who had decided that awareness of those facts was not the same thing as being stopped by them. Teak raised his hand. The Surath, what do they know about us? I thought about that for a moment. They know we fought the Orrven to a standstill at the Carina line. They know the outcome at Kelva stations. They've had compact briefings on human military capability, same as everyone else in the upper registry. And they know we're coming. I filed the approach notification with Surath Choir-Command 6 minutes ago. They acknowledged. I paused. The response was brief. They said, and I'm quoting the translation, approach granted. We did not know Earth would answer. Nobody said anything to that. We went and suited up. The Surath Choir-Reaches were beautiful. I did not expect that to be the first thing I noticed. I expected the smell of the pathogen, or the logistics problem of the altitude, or the comms traffic from Choir-Command as we made our approach. I got all of those, but I also got the plateaus. The Surath homeworld, Vale Surath, as the beacon named it, was a world of high, wide highland plains at altitudes that would have given an unprotected human serious problems, and that gave the Surath the open skis their respiratory systems had been built for. The plateaus stretched from horizon to horizon in the morning light, rust amber and pale gold, edged with white rock canyon walls that caught the sun in long lateral shadows. The atmospheric layer was thin and luminous. The Surath's highland cities were built in a style that looked, from altitude, like vast open-air amphitheaters, low, curved architecture, walls that funneled wind in deliberate harmonic patterns, no sealed-roof structures except the molting halls, where the elder caste underwent the twice-yearly feather renewal that left them vulnerable and sequestered. The cities were designed to breathe. That design, the beacon had noted with clinical neutrality, was exactly what the wasting cord pathogen was exploiting. Choir-Command gave us the landing field at first contact, a wide, open platform on the plateau's eastern edge, constructed from pale stone, currently empty of everything except a cluster of 8 or 9 Surath figures in the formal robes of the council elder cast deep iridescent blues and greens, the feathers of the display plumage ruffled and half spread in a posture I would later learn was the Surath equivalent of standing at full formal attention. They were watching us come in. I watched them on the approach camera while Teak talked me through the wind shear on the final descent. I watched them hold very still as 6 human heavy-lift dropships came down out of the morning sky in formation, our ventral thrusters raising a curtain of plateau dust that the dawn light turned briefly to copper haze. 6 ships, 31 personnel in total, with the medical and engineering teams in the bays. The Surath figures on the landing field did not scatter, did not retreat, did not do anything except watch us come down with the stillness of beings who had made a decision and were living in the consequence of it. I thought about what they must be seeing, what they knew about us, what the word human meant in every species briefing file, stamped alongside terms like Carina Line, Kelva Stations, and Morn's Reach. I thought about what it must feel like to have sent 40 days of silence and then look up and see the wrong species ships coming in low over your plateau. We landed. The landing field was at 3,800 meters. My suit handled the pressure. My body protested anyway, the way bodies do at altitude, a faint thickening behind the eyes, a reluctance in the lungs that had nothing to do with the pathogen and everything to do with the fact that we were significantly higher than humans evolved to stand. I noted it and set it aside. The ramps came down. Priya Was was first out. She moved immediately toward the Surath group with the kind of purpose that didn't leave room for ceremony, her medical kit in her left hand and a portable translator in her right, already asking questions before she'd covered half the distance. That was Priya. I followed, with Teak behind me and the engineering team beginning to work the cargo releases. The Surath elder caste at close range were extraordinary. I had seen images. The images did not prepare you. They were tall. The shortest of the 9 figures on the landing field stood nearly level with my eye line, and the central figure, the one who moved forward to meet us, stood a full head above that. The display plumage on the Elder Council ran from the crown down the back and across the primary wing feathers in a cascade of colors so specific and structured that I would later learn each pattern was a biography. Rank, lineage, choir membership, years of service, carried in the pigment and structure of every feather. The central figure's plumage was the most complex I could see. Deep indigo at the crown shading through cobalt and then a pale, almost silver-white at the tips. The whole thing held half spread in that formal attention posture, trembling slightly in the plateau wind. The translator told me his name was Threshavon, choir master of the Third Council, the highest-ranking surviving elder in the Highland cities. Surviving. I noted that word and what it implied and kept moving. Threshavon spoke first in the Surath tongue, a harmonic layered sound that I could not parse but that the translator rendered after a 2-second lag. He said, "We believed the answer would not come. Then we received your approach notification. We did not know whether to be relieved or..." A pause in the translation. The translator rendered the gap as untranslatable modifier, contextual register, mixture of awe and dread. I said, "Warrant Officer Dace Rennick, 34th Humanitarian Lift Wing, Earth Allied Defense and Relief Command. We're here to help. My chief medical engineer is already asking your senior medical officer for a situation briefing. We have 6 biocontainment rigs, supplemental atmospheric processing units, and enough supplemental oxygen to run your major molting halls for 72 hours while we get the filtration compounds indexed to your pathogen profile." I paused. "I need your medical staff to brief Priya Was, the woman who walked past me just now, as fast as possible. Can you get us that access?" Threshavon looked at me for a moment. The translator was quiet. The display plumage shifted, a slight compression at the crown, a ripple through the secondary feathers, and then he said, in the translated register of careful formality, "You came alone." 6 ships, 31 people. No, another translator gap. Without the compact, without the hegemony, you came alone. I understood what he was asking. Not a logistical question, something else, something about why. I said the compact's queue closed. The hegemony's quarter doesn't close until the 30th. Nobody else was coming. I looked at him steadily. We were, so we came. The plumage shifted again, more deeply this time, a wave moving from the crown all the way to the wing tips, and I would not understand what that meant until much later. Threshavon turned and spoke to the figures behind him in rapid Surath. Then he looked back at me and said, "Come, I will take you to the choir master's hall. Our medical senior, Rethvon, will meet you there. Whatever you need from us, ask." We went to work. The molting halls were bad. I have been in field emergencies on 6 different worlds over 9 years of flying humanitarian missions, and I have developed a certain professional relationship with the sight of suffering on a scale that exceeds what a single human nervous system was built to fully absorb. You develop categories. You develop a vocabulary of triage, of prioritization, of the clinical sequencing that lets you function in a place where the clinical is not the whole story. You do not stop feeling it. You learn to carry it in a place that doesn't impede your hands. The molting halls were long, curved structures, the walls designed for that harmonic wind channeling, the ceilings open at intervals to the sky. Normally, I gathered from Rethvan's briefing as Priya Was translated and processed simultaneously. The molting halls were places of enforced calm. The twice-yearly feather renewal left the elder caste physically depleted and acoustically sensitive, and the design of the halls was intended to buffer them from the city's ambient sound while maintaining airflow. In a city without mass respiratory illness, it was a system of elegant biological logic. Now it was a vector map. The elders lay on the low resting platforms in rows, attended by the younger Surath, the subadult caste, not yet fully feathered, moving between the platforms with the focused urgency of beings doing the only thing they could think of to do. The sound in the halls was unlike anything I had heard. The Surath in respiratory distress produced a sound that was not quite a cough, and not quite a vocalization, and not quite silence, something in between all three, a broken harmonic from a species whose entire biology was built around perfect harmonic production. The sound repeated down the rows of platforms. It filled the hall. I walked the length of the first hall once. I counted the platforms. Then I walked back and did not walk it again because once was what I needed, and more than once would have become something other than information. The attending subadults, most of them barely past the age where they would begin to develop their own council plumage, moved between the platforms with a compressed, careful quality that I recognized across the species barrier without any need for translation. It was the quality of people who have been very frightened for a long time, and have decided that fear is not useful, and have put it somewhere that allows their hands to keep working. I had seen it in humans. I had seen it in the Velnar after the compact left them adrift. I recognized it here, in the rust and copper feathers of Surath attendants who were not old enough to have voted in a council session, but who had been running 4-hour care rotations for 37 days. Priya Was walked the length of the first hall once and turned to Rethvan and said, very quietly, "Show me your archive entry on the original wasting cord suppression event." Rethvan, a younger Surath medical officer, primary feathers in an early rust and gold pattern, moving with the controlled urgency of someone who had been running on too little sleep for too long, pulled it immediately. Priya sat down on the floor of the hall right there, cross-legged, and began reading. I left her to it and went to find my engineering team. The Mark 7 biocontainment rigs were the best piece of humanitarian equipment that Earth had produced in the last 15 years, and they had been designed specifically for the problem of pathogen transmission through communal atmospheric systems. They operated on the principle of positive pressure isolation, flooding the protected space with filtered, pressurized clean air, so that the natural airflow dynamic pushed outward rather than pulling potentially contaminated exterior air in. A Mark 7 unit could bring a space of up to 40,000 cubic meters into full positive pressure isolation in approximately 40 minutes. The Surath's primary molting halls were each roughly 35,000 cubic meters. The engineering math was brutal and clean. We had 6 rigs. There were 9 primary molting halls, plus the 2 secondary halls that the subadult attendants were using as rest areas between shifts. 11 spaces to protect, 6 rigs. The priority sequencing took me about 4 minutes to work out, and it wasn't pleasant. Because priority sequencing in a space with 11 sick bays and 6 tools means you are deciding, in a structured and defensible way, which patients wait longer in worse conditions. I went through it twice to make sure I hadn't made an error, and then I called Sela Park, who was the 34th's fastest rig installation tech, and told her the sequence. Park didn't argue with it. She didn't ask me to reconsider. She looked at the list for about 5 seconds and said, "I can run the first 3 rigs myself if Kane handles the 4th. Then she paused. "The secondary halls, the attendants. They're going to develop secondary infection profiles within 36 hours if we don't protect them." "I know. 5 and 6 rigs go there, not to halls 8 and 9. That's what the sequence says." She looked at me steadily. "Good, then let's go." Dalamar had already started pulling the atmospheric processing units from the cargo bays. Dalla was the quietest person in the 34th, and possibly the most efficient. She had the first processor deployed and running on the landing field's ambient air intake before I got back to the ship, and she had already coordinated with the Surath ground crew, a team of 6 young Surath who had materialized from the city's technical district, and who, once they understood what the processors did, integrated into the deployment workflow with a focused competence that I found deeply moving in a way I couldn't immediately name. They were losing their elders. They were also doing the work. They were doing it at the same time. I went back to Priya. She was still on the floor of the first molting hall, but now Rethvan was beside her, and they were speaking in a rapid back and forth that the translator was doing its best to keep up with. Medical terminology doesn't translate cleanly across species, and the translator was flagging terms with contextual approximations every few seconds. Priya was writing in her field log and occasionally asking Rethvan to slow down. Rethvan was not exactly slowing down, but was finding ways to explain the same thing in slightly different terms until Priya's notation indicated she had it. I crouched down beside them. "What have you got?" Priya looked up. "The 500-year suppression event, they used a compound they call, roughly, cord silencing. It's a targeted mucolytic agent. It suppresses the pathogen's ability to bond to the specific receptor sites in the Surath respiratory epithelium by altering the local surface chemistry. Rethvan's archive has the compound profile. We cannot synthesize it here in the quantities they need." She paused. "But the compound's core precursors are on our standard pharmaceutical manifest. We can synthesize an analog, not identical but functionally close, maybe 85% efficacy. 85% against what they're showing. Against the symptom progression currently displayed in the first stage patients. The ones who have been ill for less than 15 days, 85% should interrupt the cascade before the secondary vascular involvement. In first stage patients, that's likely sufficient." She met my eyes. "The late stage patients, the ones who have had it for 30+ days, the most severe respiratory compromise, the analog alone won't be enough. We need to support their respiratory function externally while the compound does its work. That's what the supplemental oxygen is for. And we need to maintain the biocontainment to stop new exposures while the treatment works." "How long?" 72 hours minimum for the analog to reach effective plasma levels. 48 hours of biocontainment before we'll see measurable reduction in new transmission events. The worst affected elders." She stopped. "The ones who have been under respiratory compromise for the longest may have irreversible structural damage to the vocal architecture. The wasting cord, Rethvan tells me, does not only damage the lungs. It attacks the specific muscular and cartilaginous structures that produce the harmonic range the elders use in council. Even if we save their lives." She left the sentence incomplete. I looked at Rethvan. Rethvan was watching me with large, amber-irised eyes in a young face with feathers that hadn't yet reached the elder pigmentation. I said, carefully, "How many of the choir masters have been ill for more than 30 days?" Rethvan was quiet for a moment. Then, 41, of the 63 who serve on the High Council. I absorbed that, 41 of 63. And Threshavon, the choir master who met us at the landing field. Choir master Threshavon has been managing the first symptoms for 12 days. He has not told the council. He remained at his post. Rethvan's feathers performed a subtle compression, the same movement I had seen in Threshavon earlier, and which I was beginning to understand was the Surath gesture for something between grief and gravity. He met your ships on the landing field this morning at the cost of approximately 3 days of his remaining pre-critical window. I said nothing for a moment. Then I said to Priya, "Move Threshavon to the top of the first stage treatment list." Priya was already writing it down. The next 36 hours were the kind of work that doesn't lend itself to narrative in the way the before and after does. It is granular. It is unglamorous. It is the 1,100 decisions that happen between the arrival and the outcome, each one small enough to dismiss and important enough that if you dismiss it, the outcome changes. I will try to give you the shape of it. The biocontainment rigs went up in the sequence Park had mapped. The Mark 7 units performed within spec. The Surath technical crew, 12 people by hour 4, 20 by hour 8, learned the monitoring systems faster than I had anticipated, and by the end of the first day's shift, they were running independent checks on the positive pressure readings without being prompted. I noted this in the operational log and felt something I can only describe as quiet respect. I want to be specific about that crew because they deserve specificity. The Surath technical cast, not the Elder Council, not the medical officers, but the city maintenance and infrastructure workers who understood the molting hall systems better than anyone because they had built and repaired them, had been waiting outside the city's technical district since before we landed. They had watched our approach on the plateau's monitoring system, and then they had simply walked to the landing field and made themselves available. I do not know who made that decision. I do not know if it was a decision in the formal Surath sense, a voted thing, a council thing, or whether it was simply the thing that people do when they have been watching their civilization hold its breath for 40 days, and something finally arrives that looks like it might help. They were young, most of them. Subadult and early adult plumage, the rust and copper colors that precede the full elder caste iridescence. They had grown up in cities where the oldest, most experienced, most honored members of their society filled the molting halls with harmonic sound twice a year. Now the molting halls were full of a different sound, and these young people had walked to the landing field and waited. I assigned Teak Holland to coordinate with them. Teak was better at that kind of coordination than I was, not because he was more technical, but because he had a specific talent for finding the communication mode that worked regardless of translation gaps. He could look at what someone was trying to do and immediately understand the logistical intention behind it, and then he could work alongside them in a way that required almost no shared language. By hour 6, the Surath technical crew and Teak had developed a working operational vocabulary of approximately 40 gestures, object points, and relative hand positions that covered everything from "this pressure reading is nominal" to "that cylinder needs to go to the 3rd hall, not the 4th," to the specific rapid palm wave that meant "stop what you're doing and come here immediately." I watched them work the corridor outside the 5th molting hall at hour 9 and could not have told you, from the workflow alone, who had shown up 6 hours ago and who had been managing this building for years. That was Teak. That was what Teak did. Priya synthesized the analog compound in the 34th's mobile pharmacy module. The pharmacy module was a self-contained unit housed in one of the medium medevac shuttles, and it had been designed for exactly this kind of field synthesis. Not perfect compounds, but functional ones, built from a standardized precursor inventory against the known biological profiles of a wide range of compact member species. Surath biology was in the database because the Compact's medical registry was one of the few things the Compact did reliably and well. The synthesis took 11 hours for the first treatment scale batch. Priya supervised every hour of it personally. She came out of the pharmacy module on the far side looking the way she always looked when she had made something work that she wasn't certain would work, quieter than usual, hands very steady. 82% analog efficacy, she said. Not 85, 82. Is that within acceptable parameters? For the first stage patients, yes. For the late stage, I'd like it higher. She paused. We'll run the first stage administrations and see how the early responders present. If the response curve looks better than the model projects, the analog may be performing above its nominal efficacy in vivo. Surath biological response factors are different from what the model assumes. It performed above its nominal efficacy in vivo. By hour 24, the first 12 first-stage patients were showing measurable reduction in the respiratory inflammation markers. Not resolved, not close to resolved, but the cascade had interrupted. The curve had bent. Priya tracked it every 4 hours and reported to me and to Orrven simultaneously, in terms that were clinical and precise, and that she always prefaced by showing Orrven the raw numbers before she offered the interpretation, because she had noticed that Orrven absorbed numbers faster than translated clinical language, and she had adjusted her method accordingly. By hour 30, Orrven had started offering the interpretation before Priya finished it. Priya had started letting him. Threshavan received his first analog treatment at hour 6. He had not argued when I told him he was on the priority list. He had looked at me with those large, amber-irised eyes, dimmer than Orrven's, the way all the elder caste eyes seemed slightly dimmer than the young Surath's, as if the illness were consuming the very light in them, and said, via the translator, "Why this particular priority?" I said, "Because you spent 3 days of your window standing on a landing field to meet our ships, and that matters to us." The translator rendered his response with a 2-second lag and then flagged it. Vocalization registered, translation not possible, Old Surath register, council formal, no extant lexical equivalent in standard translation corpus. I logged it as untranslatable. I kept moving. Hour 48. The biocontainment readings across all 11 halls were holding. The transmission rate measured by the rate of new symptomatic onset in the subadult attendant population had dropped 73% from the pre-deployment baseline. Not 0, 73. The analog treatment was running in all accessible first-stage patients. 8 of the late-stage patients, the ones with the most severe respiratory compromise, were on continuous supplemental oxygen support, with the analog running alongside, and Priya was managing them in 4-hour rotation with the 34th, 2 trauma-certified medics. The Surath medical staff had integrated into every aspect of the care workflow. I had stopped directing that integration and started simply observing it, because it had long since passed the point where human direction added anything to it. Jenko, the pilot I hadn't fully evaluated yet, had turned out to be extraordinarily useful in a way I had not predicted. He had no medical training. He had no engineering specialty. What he had was the specific human talent for finding the thing that needs doing and doing it without being asked. By hour 24, he was running supply runs between the pharmacy module and the molting halls, managing the supplemental oxygen cylinder rotation, and serving as a human interface between the 34th's personnel and the Surath technical crew in ways that did not require the translator, because they were conducted entirely in gesture and demonstration, and the universal language of pointing at things that need to be moved, and then moving them. There is a particular skill in this that I think gets undercounted in the way we talk about humanitarian operations. We talk about the medical officers, the engineers, the biocontainment protocols, the pharmaceutical synthesis. These are real and they matter. But any large operation also runs on a substrate of smaller logistics that are beneath the level of official record. The cylinder that gets to the right hall at the right time, the monitoring readout that gets noticed and flagged before it becomes a problem, the meal that appears beside someone who hasn't eaten in 10 hours because someone noticed they hadn't eaten in 10 hours. Jenko ran that substrate. He ran it without being asked, without reporting it through official channels, without making it visible in any way that would have warranted an entry in my operational log. I know it happened because the operation ran better than the official logistics should have allowed, and when I looked for the reason, I found Jenko. The Surath technical crew had adopted him with a warmth that I watched from a distance and found unexpectedly difficult to quantify. He wasn't saving lives in the way Priya was saving lives. He was doing everything that made Priya's work possible. At hour 40, he had sat down on the floor of the corridor outside the fourth molting hall next to a young Surath attendant who was eating a meal alone and clearly struggling, and they had eaten together in complete silence for 20 minutes. Neither of them spoke a word of the other's language. That was fine. It was enough. I did my own work. I ran the operational logs, managed the resupply sequencing from Lannick Station. We had put in a supplemental oxygen request at hour 6 that was on track to arrive before our initial supply ran out. Coordinated with Wing Commander Sellies on the status reports that the Compact's medical liaison had started requesting once word of the unilateral deployment reached the upper registry. The Compact's inquiry was careful and formally neutral, which was the Compact's way of expressing agitation. I answered every inquiry with clinical data and the operational log and the treatment outcome curves. I did not comment on the 40 days. Sellies did not tell me to comment on the 40 days either. She was a person who understood where comments were and weren't useful. On the morning of the third day, hour 67, Threshavon walked out of the first molting hall under his own capacity. Not fully. He walked with a slowness that was not his natural gait, and the display plumage was compressed tight in the way I had learned indicated physiological cost rather than social formality. But he walked. He came out into the corridor where I was reviewing the morning numbers, and he stood very still for a moment with his face turned toward the open end of the corridor where the plateau daylight came in, and I watched him breathe. The Surath breath I had come to understand was not like a human breath. Because of the respiratory architecture, the double-bellowed lung system, the labyrinthine air sac network that gave the elder caste their harmonic range, a full Surath breath at altitude was a long, audible thing, with a faint natural resonance to it that the illness had crushed to something barely above a wheeze. What I heard now, watching Threshavon stand in the corridor light, was not a full breath. Not yet. But it was more than a wheeze. It was a breath on the way back toward itself. He turned and looked at me. I said, "The morning numbers look good. The late-stage patients are still critical, but stable. Rethvon thinks the treatment curve for the most severe cases will become clearer by hour 80. Threshavon was quiet. The translator waited. He said, "When we sent the beacon, the first beacon, 41 days ago, the council debated the wording for 3 days. We did not wish to appear weak. We did not wish to appear desperate. We wished the Compact to understand that the situation was urgent without inferring that we were unable to manage it ourselves." A pause. We inferred that we were able to manage it ourselves. We were not able to manage it ourselves. I didn't say anything. I had found over 9 years of humanitarian work that there was a particular kind of statement that a person made, or a choir master, or a council elder, or a planetary governor, that was not asking for a response. It was asking to be heard. Those two things are different in ways that matter enormously, and confusing them is the fastest way to end a conversation that needed to keep going. Threshavon was telling me something about the 40 days. He was not asking me to explain the Q purge. He was not asking me to account for the Hegemony's administrative calendar. He was accounting for something himself, and the accounting was directed inward, not at me. So I listened. The Compact cued the beacon. The Hegemony replied with administrative regret. The consortium cited quarantine protocols that they have not applied uniformly, and that we have, on record, documented 12 previous exceptions to. The display plumage shifted, not the grief gravity compression, something else, something I hadn't seen before, a slow rearrangement of the secondary feathers that looked like something settling. We sent 7 additional beacons over 40 days, through 3 separate secondary channels. We received no replies. He paused. We received no replies from the parties we expected would reply. I know, I said. I read the queue. You were at Lannick Station. Yes. Lannick Station is 11 relay jumps from Vale Surath. Yes. He considered that for a long moment. I could see him doing the calculation, not the spatial one, not the relay jump count, but the other one. The one where you try to understand what it means that someone 11 relay jumps away was reading your queue entry, and someone 3 relay jumps away was scheduling their administrative calendar. That calculation does not resolve cleanly. It does not have an answer that makes the 40 days make sense. The most you can do with it is hold it and let it be the shape it is. We had heard of humans, he said finally. The Carina line, Kelva stations. We had heard what humans do when challenged. A pause. We did not know what humans do when no one is watching. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the 34th. I thought about Priya on the floor of the first molting hall reading the 500-year archive, and Teak and his 40 gestures, and Park sequencing the biocontainment rigs with the focus of someone who was not thinking about anything except the sequence, and Jenko eating in the corridor in complete silence with a young Surath attendant who needed not to be alone. I thought about Celi's 2 lines. I thought about the beacon's medical annex, and the last entry timestamped 9 hours before I read it, and whoever had written it in the middle of a night when the queue was already closed. I said the same thing. Hour 81. The late-stage patient treatment curve broke in the direction Priya had hoped it would. 3 of the 8 critical elders showed enough respiratory improvement to reduce their supplemental oxygen flow rate. 1. An elder named Vethron, the oldest member of the High Council at approximately 240 years by Surath reckoning, who had been ill for 37 days, produced a vocalization on the morning round that Rethvon stopped in the middle of his assessment to listen to. Not a word. Not even a formed sound. A single note held for approximately 2 seconds at the lower register of what an elder caste Surath could produce. I want to try to describe what that sounded like, because I think it matters. The Surath elder caste vocal range in full health occupied a frequency bandwidth that partially exceeded human auditory perception at both ends. The sub-bass harmonics you felt in the chest rather than heard, and the ultra-register high tones that the translator identified but that human ears registered only as a pressure behind the sinuses. 240 years of vocal development. 60 years as the primary voice of a council chamber. In full health, the sound that Vethron could produce was, by every account I subsequently read in the Surath record, something that filled rooms and changed the acoustic character of the spaces she occupied. What she produced now was a single note at the lower register. It lasted 2 seconds. It was thin and uncertain, and it trembled. It was the first thing resembling intentional vocalization she had produced in 37 days. It was the most important sound I heard on Vale Surath. Rethvon stood completely still for those 2 seconds. Then he turned to Priya and said something in Surath that the translator rendered as, "She is trying to remember the chord." Priya said gently, "That's a good sign, isn't it?" Rethvon looked at her. The young amber eyes, too bright, too raw, too recently on the far side of 37 days of watching the worst thing that could happen to a Surath happen to the people who had made him who he was. He was quiet for a moment that was longer than a processing pause, longer than a translation lag, and then he said, "She was the primary voice of the council chamber for 60 years. The chord she holds, the founding harmonic of the third council, she has held that chord at every session for as long as anyone serving on the current council has been alive. She was the one who," he stopped, tried again, "if she remembers it." He didn't finish. He went back to the assessment. He was very precise for the next 4 minutes, checking every monitoring readout, logging every vital sign, making sure the supplemental oxygen flow rate was adjusted correctly for the new intake numbers. His hands did not tremble. His notation was clean and exact. Then he went to stand in the corridor for 2 minutes and I did not follow him. We are good at knowing when not to follow. The supplemental oxygen resupply arrived from Lannick at hour 84. 2 additional medium shuttles Sellies had sent them without being asked, which was Sellies. The new supply extended our operational window to 12 days. I put in the calculation for what it would take to keep 1 or 2 of the biocontainment rigs on station for the 30 days that Priya estimated the Surath would need to maintain suppression protocols before the pathogen could be declared contained. The math on that involved requesting a formal humanitarian station-keeping authorization from the Compact, which I submitted at hour 85, with a note that I would appreciate a timely response, given that the last Compact review had taken 40 days to return a purge notice. I phrased the note politely. I was very careful with the phrasing. Wing Commander Sellies approved the station-keeping request internally within 2 hours. The Compact's formal authorization followed 6 hours later. The Compact's note noted that the 34th unilateral deployment had exceeded the standard humanitarian response parameters in several procedural respects, and that a procedural review meeting would be scheduled at a later date. I filed the note under administrative correspondence and went back to the morning numbers. The morning numbers were good. They kept being good. They were not perfect. The late-stage patients were a slow, uncertain recovery, and the vocal architecture damage in the most severely affected elders was real and would require assessment over months, not hours. The Surath medical system was, with Rethvan's coordination, running independently at full capacity by day 4. The 34th's direct patient care role was diminishing in the way it should, the way it is supposed to diminish, the way you know you have done the thing right when your presence becomes less necessary. The translation of the analog synthesis protocol to Surath pharmaceutical manufacture was underway. The biocontainment monitoring was fully in Surath technical hands. On the morning of day 5, I told Teak Holland to prepare 2 of the heavy lifters for departure. We would leave 2 ships on station keeping mine and Dalla Mars, along with 2 of the Mark 7 rigs and Priya Was, who had declined to leave and whom I had long ago stopped arguing with about professional matters. The other 4 ships would return to Lannick for rest rotation and then come back to relieve us in 8 days. I told Threshavon the schedule. He received it quietly. On the morning of departure, he met me on the landing field. The plateau was in the long morning light that I had started to think of as the Surath day's most beautiful hour, the sun low enough that the canyon walls to the east caught it sideways, turning everything rust and gold, and a shade of pale amber that I could not precisely name. The wind was down. The air tasted of altitude and the faint mineral scent of the plateau stone. Threshavon stood at the edge of the landing field in his full council robes. The display plumage had come up from its compressed illness posture, not fully, not the full formal attention spread of 5 days ago, but more than it had been, and the colors in it, the deep indigo and cobalt and silver white, caught the morning light in a way that made it look lit from within. He was breathing with more depth than he had been. Not fully, but more. The 4 departing ships were warmed up and ready. My ship was staying. I walked to meet him. We stood for a moment without speaking. The translator was on my collar. The Surath knew this, and had always allowed for the translation lag. I waited. Threshavon looked at me for a long time with the amber eyes, clearer now than they had been on the first morning, the illness dimming, retreating degree by degree. He looked at me the way someone looks at something they are trying to fix permanently in memory. Then he spread the display plumage to its full formal attention width. The full spread, every feather out, the morning light catching the whole cascade of color, and lowered his head in a posture that even without translation I understood was the maximum formal deference the Surath elder caste possessed. And he spoke. One phrase. Long, layered, the harmonic undertones of old Surath council formal, the register that the translator had no lexical equivalent for. The translator was silent. I waited. The translator stayed silent. I said quietly, "Did you get any of it?" The translator responded, vocalization registered. Language identified, Old Surath, Third Council Formal Register. No extant lexical equivalent in standard corpus. Partial tonal interpretation suggests gratitude, permanence, and a structural element consistent with Surath oath forms. Full translation not possible. I looked at Threshavon. He had brought his head back up. He was watching me. I said, I'm going to log that as untranslatable. He did not respond. He continued to look at me with the full plumage out and the morning light on it, and the plateau wind moved through the feathers in a slow, ruffling wave, and I did not ask for a translation, and he did not offer one. I raised my hand, the human gesture, palm open, which the Surath had learned over 5 days of working beside us, was how we say something that doesn't require words. It had started with Teak, who had used it on the first morning when he needed the technical crew to understand that a monitoring reading was good and no intervention was required. By day 2, most of the Surath technical crew was using it back at us, and by day 4 it had spread to some of the medical attendants in the molting halls. We had not taught it. They had simply adopted it, the way you adopt a useful thing from someone you are working beside, when the working is close enough and long enough that the useful things become shared. Threshavon held the plumage spread for another moment. The plateau wind moved through it again, the silver-white tips catching the morning light in a ripple that went from the crown all the way to the outermost wing feathers and back. Then I turned and walked back to my ship. I logged the departure at 8:47 Vale Surath local. The 4 departing ships lifted in formation, their ventral thrusters raising the copper plateau dust one more time, and I watched them climb from the landing field until the morning sky folded them into the thin, luminous upper atmosphere, and they were gone. I stood on the landing field for another minute. The Surath technical crew was moving behind me, running the morning biocontainment checks with the steady, internalized competence of people who had learned a system and made it theirs. Somewhere in the city, Priya Was was doing morning rounds with Reth Vaughn. Jenko, who had elected to stay on station, his choice, unprompted, and I had approved it because I had fully evaluated him now, and the evaluation was complete and favorable, was almost certainly already in the corridors doing the thing that needed doing. I had a procedural review meeting to look forward to, at some unspecified future date, with the Galactic Compact. I had 41 days' worth of purge notices in my administrative correspondence file. I had a supplemental oxygen resupply on rotation schedule. I had a biocontainment monitoring log that was producing clean readings at 6-hour intervals. I had a pharmaceutical synthesis protocol that Reth Vaughn's medical team was now running independently. I had 8 late-stage patients whose recovery curves were going in the right direction slowly, not predictably, but in the right direction. I had the translation log entry from 8:23 this morning, vocalization registered. Language identified, Old Surath, Third Council Formal Register. No extant lexical equivalent in standard corpus. Partial tonal interpretation suggests gratitude, permanence, and a structural element consistent with Surath oath forms. Full translation not possible. I went inside and did the morning numbers. They were good. They kept being good. And I did not need to know what the words meant to know what the words meant.